5% of the entire UK population signed up for tickets to the Oasis Knebworth concert in 1996. In 2 years, they went from having 0 fans to becoming the biggest band in the UK since the Beatles. 13 years later, the band broke up and the Gallagher brothers haven't talked to each other ever since. So what the f happened? Looking back at their career now, 15 years after Noel left the band, Oasis feels like this airplane that was traveling at supersonic speed, faster than any airplane in the sky. So fast they ended up getting ahead of every other band of the 90s. Eventually, they started losing control of their ship, panicked, and crashed into one of the buildings in Lower Manhattan, New York. What makes this joke even better is that Liam Gallagher was voted the most hated man of 2001. Yes, even more hated than that other fella. But how did they genuinely end up like this? How did they go from ruling the world of rock and roll to not talking to each other in 15 years? Well, that's exactly what I'm gonna be talking about today. Before I get into this video, make sure to subscribe because I will cover other 90s bands in the future, including the Stone Roses and Radiohead. And also, I've already made a video on Blur. Let me know any other bands you want me to talk about in the comments, and I hope you enjoy. This is the history of Oasis, their rise to fame, and their eventual downfall. Also, I have to mention that a big source of this video is taken from the 2016 Oasis documentary, Supersonic, but there's a lot of other stuff I added. If you do want to check that whole thing out, I highly recommend it because it's great. Okay, so our story begins in 80s Manchester, the birthplace of a lot of great British bands. The Gallagher family was a working class family of Irish descent, and they had 3 sons. Liam, Noel, and their brother Paul. Now Liam and Noel, being the 2 youngest ones, had to share a room together. Even though the 2 brothers grew up in the same room, they were pretty different from each other. Noel was the quiet kid who'd get grounded a lot, and while locked up in his room, he started learning this old guitar that his drunk dad had won in a game of cards. Liam, on the other hand, for the better part of his teenage life, could not give less of a f about music. So much so that he even bullied people who were in a band, and people who weren't in a band. Kind of just bullied everyone. One magical day though, some kid from a rival school got into a fight with Liam and bashed him in the head with a hammer. Since that day, Liam started thinking that he's the next John Lennon, and his main goal in life was becoming a rock star. After that, he became the lead singer of a band called The Rain, along with Bonehead, Tony McCarroll, and Guigsy. Liam then changed the name of the band to Oasis, because he thought The Rain sounded shit. Now you might be hearing the story and saying, where's Noel in all of this? Well, Noel at the time was a drum technician for an Inspiral Carpet road crew, truly making the most of his talent. This was also the time where Noel had his best haircut, and he was also experimenting with drugs. Okay, a bit of a sideline here, but I found this picture of Noel in his Inspiral Carpet days. I never really thought much of it, because I feel like if Noel was bi or gay, he wouldn't really care and he would have come out by now. But because of this picture and his friendship with Johnny Marr, Reddit seems to have a different idea. Is Noel Gallagher bisexual? I don't want to start a trashy conversation, but I heard that Noel was probably Johnny Marr's boyfriend back in the day, and that's why Oasis got signed. Been wondering if it's true or not. Please no gay insults.
If so, then what? Does the answer on this question really elucidate something significant? I think no. Is it possible to gain a tremendously expensive guitar just being friends and having no homo affinity? I think yes. Is it possible to get so high and be caught like 1,000 times with some other guy hugging in an ambiguous pose? I think yes! Is it possible to kiss brother, meaning only brotherhood and nothing incestuous? Again, being high like the space? I do think it is!
Yeah, perfect. As funny as this is, I do have to agree with the commenter. Except for the ambiguous part, because there's nothing ambiguous about these pictures.
I call myself straight, but I'm told.
Say it, Noel. Come on, say it loud and say it proud.
I'm gay!
At last.
Okay, sorry, back to the video. After traveling the world with the Inspiral Carpets, Noel got fired from his job for being unprofessional. Who would have guessed? He came back home and saw that his brother and his friends had started a band. And they didn't actually sound that bad.
Take me when I'm young and true. Was it me or was it you?
He went into one of their shows and the band asked him to be their manager at first, but then eventually he just joined the band as the main guitarist. Now we all know the story of Oasis as these guys who picked up a guitar and immediately started selling out stadiums, but that wasn't the case at first, obviously. The band just practiced intensely for around 2 years straight. They were dedicated to making this happen. If anyone missed practice, they would be sacked from the band for a month, and they just had to sit in their rooms while the rest of the band got better. It was clear Liam and Noel really wanted this, and they weren't gonna let anyone get in their way. The rest of the band soon learned to adapt to their rules, and everyone was giving their 100%. For 2 years, all they did was practice. Everyone else was going to the hacienda and dancing to the beats of electronic and acid house music. But Liam Liam and Noel weren't into that at all. They just liked rock and roll and getting stoned with their friends while playing. Even before they played their first gig, they were already living like rock stars, just without the money part. I'll talk about the stoning part later, but the band was smoking like every single day, especially Quigsy. Everyone was just there to have fun, and they really only cared about rock and roll. Well, everyone except Tony McCarroll, who had to constantly think about his daughter. Bonehead was chill though. Okay, so now that we know all the band members and their intentions, it's time for the magic to happen. It had been like a year since the band started, and one beautiful day, Noel showed up to practice with a brand new song. He played it in front of everyone, and Bonehead just didn't believe that Noel actually wrote this. He was destined to find where Noel nicked this from, because this song was like nothing else they had made before. From this moment, the bar was raised to the sky, and they knew that everything else they made needed to go on par with this song. That song was Live Forever. After that, the band started going on gigs and kept practicing, but nobody was paying attention to them. Just gig after gig, and nothing happened. They were still determined to keep going, and after a couple of months, they met this band called Sister Lovers. Now, what was special about this band is that Debbie Turner, the lead singer of the band, was an ex-girlfriend of Alan McGee, the head of Creation Records. For those who don't know, Creation Records already had a pretty good roster, with bands like My Bloody Valentine, The Jesus and Mary Chain, Primal Scream, and etc. But they were just about to sign their biggest stars yet. The Sister Lovers had just secured a gig in Glasgow, and they decided to also invite Oasis with them. Before that, you remember that Johnny Marr discussion from earlier? Well, this story started right before the Glasgow gig. Noel had met Johnny Marr's brother at the Hacienda, and he gave him one of the early Oasis demos with his number written on it. Somehow, Johnny Marr actually decided to listen to the demo, and decided to call Noel, and the two have been friends ever since. Yes, Johnny Marr from the Smiths was one of the first few Oasis fans in the world. He was also asked by Noel to join the band at some point, but sadly he did refuse. Johnny attended one of their gigs and noticed that the band took way too long to tune their guitars between songs, so he decided to give Noel a 1960 Les Paul, the same guitar you see in the Live Forever music video. That guitar ended up being smashed into some guy's head on one of the band's later gigs, so they had to call Johnny to ask for another guitar. Johnny Marr said okay and sent him a 1978 Les Paul Custom, with a note that said, "This one's well heavy, next time you'll take the fucker out." That Les Paul was the guitar that Johnny used to write Big Mouth Strikes Again, and it was the guitar he used on the whole The Queen Is Dead album. A pretty lucky thing to happen to the band. But we need to go back to that Glasgow gig. The band saved up some money and got a shitty van for them to sleep in, bought a bunch of weed and headed straight to Glasgow, because why not? This was their first gig outside of Manchester. There was a problem though. Oasis wasn't on the band list. They weren't allowed to play tonight, and all of this effort and money was gonna go for nothing. Luckily, Noel had this genius idea of just threatening the guy who didn't want to let them play.
So we just informed him, and there was like 20 of us, and there was only two of him.
Yeah.
And it's like,
So we said, well, if you don't let us play, the odds are stacked amazingly in our favour. So.
And it worked, because they got to perform for 20 minutes. Even more luckily, Alan McGee had decided to show up that day just to piss off his ex-girlfriend, and immediately after listening to them, he decided he wanted to sign them. All of this wouldn't have happened if the band just went home after they got rejected for the gig. They were literally the uninvited guests who stayed till the end. A story straight out of a movie. All their friends and family couldn't believe them, but Liam and Noel just knew that, sooner or later, this was all destined to happen. Alan McGee wanted the first single of the band to be Bring It On Down, and so the band started working on recording it. Things weren't exactly going to plan though. There were some problems with the drummer, and they were struggling with finishing the song. The band went outside to get a quick break and eat some Chinese food, but Noel decided to stay inside. While the others were outside for maybe like 30 minutes, Noel decided to quickly write a new song. That song was Supersonic. The band ended up recording and mixing the song that very night, and decided to make it their first single. The song now has more than 156 million plays, and it was written in less than 30 minutes. Noel Gallagher was just on a whole other level in the 90s, it's insane. Supersonic got the ball rolling, and from then, the band just started going gig after gig, constantly performing and constantly getting banned by hotels because they kept throwing their mattresses out the window. They would also constantly get high, and they would get into fights all the time. It was just punk all over again, but this time the guitar came from the Beatles. They were living the life. So much so that they got arrested in their first international gig in the Netherlands, because they started a fight on the ferry. There was a small problem though. These fights were starting to get attention by the media. The more they fought, the more the newspapers would write about them. The more people would show up in their concerts to fuck everything up, and it was just a never-ending cycle. Liam absolutely loved it, but Noel thought that this was stealing the attention from the important stuff, the music.
These lot think it's rock and roll to get thrown off a ferry. To get shut up. These lot think it's rock and roll to get thrown. Shut the fuck up, man. These lot think. And we're gonna have to say this, Fat. Are you gonna shut up? These lot think it's rock and roll to get thrown off a ferry, right? To come into hotel fires, to get everybody at it, and they go, shut up. They start thinking, hey, it's rock and roll.
This was also the reason why Liam and Noel's relationship was starting to crack, and the drugs certainly didn't help. Nonetheless, the band started working on their debut album, Definitely Maybe. After going through 2 different producers and just hundreds of takes, they just could not get the sound right. Alan McGee knew what they sounded like live, and that was just not it. The band was getting frustrated, and they just wanted to wrap the whole thing up. But McGee kept telling them to go back in the studio until they got it right.
When we went up to McGee's flat that night, and we'd been mixing Columbia for about, I think it was about the 100th mix, and we got there, and before we pressed play on the tape recorder, we said, before we start, this is the fucking bollocks, wait till you hear this, and if you don't fucking like this, me and him are washing our hands of the album, and you're gonna have to get somebody else to mix it. And it come on, and we sat there, and the minute it fucking come on, the pair of us just went, it sounds fucking awful.
It's not just the fact that he discovered them inside them. If it wasn't for his determination for perfection, the band would never be where they are now. He kept spending thousands and thousands of pounds on Oasis, because he knew there was something there. Even the album cover art needed to be perfect. Just look at the cover art of Definitely Maybe. Might be one of my favorite album covers ever. Eventually the band got Owen Morris to mix the album, and he finally got the sound of the band right. He made the record have the same vibe as their live performances, and the album was finished. August 29th, 1994, Definitely Maybe came out, and it instantly became the highest selling debut album of all time. It took over England in a way that was never seen before. It hit number 1 in the charts, and it's still one of the most iconic albums of 90s Britain, and also one of my favorite albums of all time. This is obviously a personal opinion, but most fans of the band, including Noel, still think that Definitely Maybe is their best album. And I have to agree. As much as the band doesn't like to admit it, they got really lucky that the album came out during the whole Britpop thing. But I think Definitely Maybe works on a whole other level. Firstly, even though the album sounded very British, the lyrics weren't about England or Manchester at all. They were about living life. I hate comparing bands to each other because I think it's nonsense. But if Blur described the working class in the UK, Oasis was the working class. This was music by the people for the people. The critics hated them, but that just worked more in their favor. I think to this day people try to listen to Definitely Maybe and start overanalyzing it. And that's what I did as well at first. But it's not about that at all. It's just, hey, we know life sucks, but there's no point in crying about it. Just grab your guitar and enjoy to the fullest, because things will get better. It connected with everyone, not just the UK audience, and it just gave hope and confidence to people. I think maybe it's hard for some people to connect with that message, because, you know, they never really struggled financially while growing up. I don't know, maybe I'm reaching a little bit, but when you listen to Definitely Maybe, you just get that feeling that someday you're gonna be on top of the world, and everything is gonna be okay. And it works, because it's genuine. They came from nothing, and they outsold everyone. They weren't meant to be there from day one, but because they believed in themselves, they ended up as one of the biggest bands in UK history. Of course, some of the criticisms are valid, like Noel's nonsensical lyrics on some of the songs, but Oasis is great, and you either get it or don't get it, and it's fine if you don't get it, everyone has their own taste. Anyways, Oasis wasn't too concerned about what the critics were saying, because they were already starting to tour the world. After an amazing Japan concert, they had to go to America. This is where the troubles began. Would they be able to make it big here, or would they feel like their future rivals back in UK? Now, Oasis wasn't really too concerned about selling records on the other side of the ocean like Blur. They had a completely different problem. That problem's name was methamphetamine. They went to play at Whiskey A Go Go, one of the most legendary nightclubs in America. They had one of the worst performances in the band's history.
Just too fast for me!
Just terrible. Noel was already not a big fan of the band going apeshit for nothing, and that night was one of the worst nights with Oasis. So bad, in fact, that he got some money and just left the band to go to San Francisco. The band had just played a gig there, and Noel had fallen in love with this San Franciscan girl. He grabbed some money, went back to her, and while he was there, he wrote Talk Tonight, one of his best written songs lyric-wise.
But I wanna talk tonight.
Talk Tonight is one of the band's saddest songs, and you can tell it genuinely came from the heart. But this little love story wasn't gonna affect only this one song. There was more to come in the future. The girl's name was Melissa Lim, and thankfully she convinced Noel to not break up the band. His managers found him, they finished their tour in America, and they went back home. Only this time, Noel wasn't fucking around anymore. When they got home, they started working on their second studio album, What's the Story, Morning Glory. The band recorded their first single, Some Might Say, and immediately after that, he decided to sack Tony McCarroll from the band and replace him with a new drummer. It was obvious that there wasn't a fight for the throne anymore. Whatever Noel said was gonna be done, at least for now. Now the Morning Glory recording sessions went way better than the Definitely Maybe ones. So good actually that they were recording a song a day.
Liam was extraordinary, and they had this freaky thing where Noel would play the song once on acoustic guitar in the control room to Liam, give him the words, and he'd fucking sing it. Noel would listen to it once to check Liam's got the phrase in for the entire song that he's only just heard the once. Noel would go, nice one, Liam. 5 songs, 5 days, man. Fucking amazing.
Was this because Noel was now the leader and he knew everything? No, it was probably because they had a proper producer this time. But the band was definitely more in line because of Noel. This recording session wasn't all sunshine and rainbows though, because in one of the nights, Liam brought some people over to the studio while Noel was recording. They got into a huge fight, and Noel ended up hitting him in the head with a cricket bat. What a headshot percentage of that man. Jokes aside, you can clearly see that their relationship was starting to get even worse. It didn't matter for them though, because they kept going. The band was about to release their second studio album, but there was a catch. Blur was about to release their newest album as well. Uh-oh. Now, these were the 2 biggest bands in Britain at the time. Surely they would be mature and professional about this, right? Well, Blur decided to reschedule their single Country House on the same day as Roll With It was set to release. There's some theories about why this happened. Some say Damon was pissed at Noel and Liam. Some say it was just to get more sales on the album. And some might say it was because of a girl. Doesn't matter, because this started what was going to be known as the Battle of Britpop. Now, I've said this story once on this channel, and this battle definitely affected Blur way more than Oasis. But nonetheless, everyone was talking about it. 25th of April 1995 was the day when both Country House and Roll With It were released. The media was looking at this as more of a class war than a battle of bands. And in the end, Blur got #1 and performed on Top of the Pops. Well, they got #1 for that week. But when both albums came out, Morning Glory massively outsold The Great Escape. People now don't realize this, but at the time Oasis was the underdog, and this growth was just never seen before. In the span of 2 years, they went from barely finding any gigs to making the 5th greatest selling album in UK history. The only other band to grow this fast was those boys from Sheffield, and they had the whole internet helping them. I will probably make a separate video about this album, but What's the Story, Morning Glory became one of the most iconic UK albums ever. The album featured a very well-known Wonderwall, the one song everyone learns when they pick up a guitar. It also featured Don't Look Back in Anger, another UK anthem, and one of Noel's best written songs. Melissa Lim, that girl from America, later came out and said that both Morning Glory and Don't Look Back in Anger were inspired by her.
Our relationship fizzled out over a couple of months as he met Meg Matthews. During one of our transatlantic phone conversations, I greeted him with, "What's the story, Morning Glory? I'm also responsible for being the guy with a Snapple strawberry obsession in Talk Tonight." Unfortunately, after a disappointing reunion with Noel backstage at the Fillmore in San Francisco, in my naively wishful state, I also told him that I wouldn't look back in anger with everything that's happened, and that I hoped to remain friends. I heard that song while grocery shopping in a Safeway not too long ago, and wished I'd skipped that moment of backstage despair. I do wish the band well. Contrary to bad PR, Liam was always a gentleman to me. I hope they can somehow regain the momentum they lost after penning their masterpiece.
Also, the album had Champagne Supernova, which Americans love.
Pretty well, but I enjoy your solo work. It's phenomenal. Yeah. Someday you will find me.
And contains one of Liam's best vocal performances. 1995 to 1996 was the peak of Oasis. They were selling out stadiums, they were breaking records left and right, they were making history with their concerts. As I mentioned in the intro, 5% of the population signed up for their Knebworth concert in 1996. 5%. That concert ended up selling 500,000 tickets in 2 of the nights that the band performed on, and became one of the biggest concerts in UK history. That record was later broken by Robbie Williams by all people, Liam's old friend. But if the band wouldn't have refused to do another 2 nights at Knebworth, nobody would ever break their record. They were literally on top of the world, but being on top of the world only meant one thing. The only way they could go now was down, and down they went. This insane fame they reached, the pressure was getting heavier and heavier. The public naturally expected Noel to ride the next Morning Glory, and even though Liam's performances were good, his voice was starting to wear out. When Liam went on stage, he just gave everything he had, and that's probably what made these concerts so iconic. He always gave 110%. Of course, this couldn't go on forever, and with Liam's voice getting worse and worse, he would start walking out in the middle of gigs. Noel started replacing him on vocals, because there was literally nothing else he could do. This was the start of the end. Liam was starting to feel easily replaced because of this. His voice kept getting worse and worse, and the drugs just fucked him up even more. Even though we all know now how legendary Morning Glory was, Noel and Liam still hadn't realized the sheer size of it. But they were about to be aware very soon. This was the moment where everything changed with Oasis. The whole, and I mean the whole world, was looking at them. They weren't this silly up and coming band anymore. They were the next Beatles. Little side note, I said the whole world here, but apparently Oasis doesn't really have this legendary status in the US, or at least didn't have it in the 90s. I guess Americans are just allergic to good music. Anyways, Liam and Noel were constantly on the papers, and they just did not care. They would say anything to piss people off. If I talk about all the controversies the Gallagher brothers had, this video would be an hour long.
Oh, people, so many people, and they walk your counting hands through their shite life.
From slagging off every band on the planet, to saying that drugs were like tea for them, to getting banned from airline companies, people started to talk about them more and more and more. Half the world hated them, and the other half absolutely adored them. There's only one thing for sure. Everyone knew of them. With all this insane hype, instead of stopping for a minute and catching some breath, the band went straight back to the studio to start working on their third studio album, Be Here Now. Now, I personally like this album, but it sure wasn't Definitely Maybe or Morning Glory. Noel has come out multiple times publicly and said that he hates the way the band approached this album. The mixing on it was terrible, the songs went on for too long, and they gave themselves no chance to actually stop and think about what they're doing. They didn't realize at the time that Morning Glory wasn't no ordinary album, and they couldn't just release anything after it. Anyways, August 21st, 1997, Oasis releases Be Here Now. Even though Noel doesn't like it, the album broke the record for the most sales in an album's first week, and it held that record until 2015. The band got so big that not only did Be Here Now get number 1, but every studio album that they released after that would hit number 1. It didn't matter the album, it was Oasis. After Be Here Now in 1998, they released the beloved B-Sides album, the Masterplan. Now, a lot of fans listen to this album and say, why the f weren't these songs on the main album? And that would be a completely fair question. Why aren't these songs on the main album? Well, Noel Gallagher in the 90s was just a songwriting machine, and every time Oasis released an EP, it would always include at least 4 tracks. So Alan McGee would just go to Noel and tell him they needed a new song for a B-side, and he would just write it immediately. After writing it, he would just say, okay, this is a B-side song, it's not gonna be included on the main album, and nobody could change his mind. Now, a lot of these songs ended up being really good, like the Masterplan. But Noel just saw them as B-sides at the time, and only later did he realize the mistake he had made. If you're a new Oasis fan and you haven't listened to the Masterplan, I highly recommend it because it's amazing. Anyways, this album also wrapped up the 90s for Oasis. It was the beginning of the new millennium, and everything was about to change. This is where we see the downfall of the band. In December of 1999, Alan McGee shut down Creation Records and basically quit Oasis. Now, do you remember how I said earlier that McGee was a really important part of the band? Well, now it's gonna be very clear. James Hargreaves' Guitar has an amazing video about the difference between Oasis in the 90s and Oasis in the 2000s, and I do highly recommend checking out his channel if you're a big Oasis fan. In this video, he explains that because McGee wasn't there for the band anymore, there wasn't this demand for perfection. Noel opened up a new label called Big Brother, and obviously, because he didn't have any experience with managing bands, things didn't go so well. You can see the effect McGee had on the band just from the album covers. This wasn't the only reason why the band changed. Now, 2000's Oasis isn't bad at all, it just wasn't on the same level as their early years. But there's still some great songs on this album, and I personally quite like Don't Believe the Truth. The reason why the band changed this drastically was because, believe it or not, drugs. Drugs were a big part of the band and their lifestyle, and Liam and Noel made this very clear. But they couldn't keep going like this. Because of all the drugs and the pressure he had at the time, Noel started having panic attacks. Thankfully, he realized the effect his lifestyle had on him before it was too late, and he decided he needed to quit. Now there was a small problem with this, because every single song that Noel wrote in the 90s was written while he was high. Every single one of them.
What great Oasis songs were not written on drugs? None. Before 1997, I hadn't written a song without the aid of the old Colombian marching gear. Don't forget, I was on drugs before I was even in a band. I was a roadie for 3 years within Spiral Carpets. I remember Enough Me Not and going into the back room and setting the goal of writing a song in 10 minutes. That was supersonic. All those albums and B-sides were written on drugs. That's why they're so good. And that pisses me off. I think maybe I should get back into taking drugs, they'll be brilliant again. But that thought lasts less than a second. Is that sad? Your best work was conceived off your nut? No. The first two albums are widely regarded as two of the greatest British albums of all time. But Be You There Now isn't my best work. I've got kids now. Dad cannot be a drug addict. That's bollocks. It's not right.
Now, was Noel Gallagher good because he was high all the time? I think not. They obviously affected him, but the talent was there from the beginning. You can smoke all day and you still won't be able to write Definitely Maybe if you're not him, so don't get any wrong ideas. Noel quitting this lifestyle meant that he needed to learn how to write songs sober. This was pretty hard for him in the beginning. He still wrote a lot of good songs sober, with and without Oasis, but he needed to make an album now. The pressure was on, Bonnet and Guigsy left the band, Alan McGee quit, and Liam's voice was just getting worse. As a result of all these things, we got Standing on the Shoulder of Giants. This album includes some good songs, like Fucking in the Bushes and Gas Panic, but it was just not the same thing as 90s Oasis. Nonetheless, 28th of February 2000, Oasis released their fourth studio album, and of course, they went immediately on tour after that. Now, a lot of Oasis tours didn't really go according to plan. This one was just the worst thing for the band at this point. They had a really disastrous concert in Wembley Stadium because Liam got drunk after his wife left him, which is the funniest thing in the world. But what's even worse was when their concert got cancelled in Barcelona. Alan White got injured and he couldn't play, so they decided to cancel the gig and just drink with each other. This led to Liam getting really drunk again and starting a huge fight with Noel. The fight got physical, and by the end, Liam told Noel that his daughter wasn't actually his. Which is funny because Noel's daughter dressed up as him once for Halloween, and she looks exactly like her dad. Anyways, this argument caused Noel to leave the band and they had to finish the tour without him. 2 years later, they came back together to release their fifth studio album, Heat and Chemistry. It became pretty obvious that this constant fight the brothers had was starting to affect the music, because Heat and Chemistry is fucking awful. Now, I know there's gonna be people in the comments defending this album, and that's great, but I personally don't like it. Another problem I have with Heat and Chemistry is that it shows up before Definitely Maybe on Spotify. Now, who the fuck decided that? Morning Glory doesn't even deserve to show up before Definitely Maybe, not this. Of course, with this album came another horrible tour in 2002. Liam's voice was getting so bad that he actually started constantly leaving the stage, sometimes after only performing 4 songs. In Germany, he got his teeth knocked out by a police officer, and they had to cancel their gigs there. Somehow, after all of this, the band kept going. Liam and Noel's relationship was getting worse and worse, but in 2005, they released Don't Believe the Truth, which I actually like a lot, because it includes Lila. Still, the story just keeps repeating. The album wasn't critically acclaimed, but it still hit #1. The band started touring, and the brothers would fight, and they would make these fights very well known to the public. Somehow, they still kept going, and 3 years later, in 2008, Oasis released their 7th and last studio album, Dig Out Your Soul. This album also had some good songs, but it wasn't good as a whole. Even though it got them a bunch of money, it wasn't really liked by the critics, or by a lot of the fans to be honest. After the release of this album, there was another public fight between the brothers. This time, Liam cancelled a show in 2009 after saying that he had laryngitis. Noel came out publicly and said that this wasn't true and he was actually hungover. This and another fight they had about Liam's clothing brand being promoted on Oasis finally marked the end for Noel, and on 28th of August 2009 he decided to quit the band permanently, and apparently the two brothers haven't talked to each other ever since. 3 months later, Liam decided to create a new band, but after 5 years that went to shit as well. Now, both Liam and Noel have their own solo careers, which are going pretty good for them. Noel is working with Johnny Marr from The Smiths, and Liam is working with Sean Squire of the Stone Roses. There's been a few hints of a reunion here and there, but lately Liam came out and shut these rumors down.
What's the question?
The only reason I'm asking you, I wasn't going to ask you,
But because I read recently that you and Noel were talking again, and there was a chance you might think
I
again.
haven't spoken to him. I haven't spoken to him for about 10 years.
Wow.
2009, I think.
Yeah, it's just sad seeing the way these two went, when you realize that they actually haven't spoken to each other in 15 years. I feel like if they decided to quit the band earlier, or take a long break, things might have gone better, but that obviously didn't happen. Who knows though, maybe they're gonna reunite in the future. Let me know your favorite Oasis albums in the comments and any other topics you want me to talk about. Subscribe and check out the Patreon because this video took me way too fucking long to make.